The house breathed quietly around me that night, each settled creak of old wood marking time in a way that felt almost ceremonial. I sat in my study with only the amber glow of the desk lamp cutting through the darkness, my family asleep upstairs in rooms that suddenly felt like they belonged to strangers. The letter lay before me on the mahogany surface, cream-colored paper that seemed to pulse in the lamplight like something alive. I knew that handwriting. Even after all these years, even though the ink had faded to sepia and the paper had yellowed at the edges, I recognized the careful slant of those letters, the way the pen had pressed just slightly too hard in places, as if the writer had been nervous or uncertain. My name was written there in blue ink that had turned almost gray with time. Nathaniel. Not Nate, not Mr. Richardson, but my full name in the voice of someone who had once known me as I truly was. My fingers traced the envelope's edge without breaking the seal. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble if I pressed too hard, and I found myself holding my breath as though any sudden movement might make this moment disappear. I had been avoiding this letter for 3 days now, moving it from the kitchen counter to the hall table to my briefcase, and finally here, to this sanctuary where I thought I could face whatever words waited inside. Instead, I found myself removing my wedding ring. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if I were performing some kind of ritual I didn't fully understand. The gold band slipped over my knuckle with a soft resistance that spoke of 23 years of wearing it without question. When I placed it on the leather desk blotter, the sound was barely audible, just a whisper of metal against leather, but it felt final in a way that made my chest tighten. Without the ring, my finger looked pale and naked, marked by a thin indentation that would take months to fade. I stared at that white band of skin as though it held answers I wasn't ready to hear. That's when the memory came, unbidden and sharp as a knife's edge. I was 17 again, standing in Peterson's field after a late autumn rain, my sneakers sinking into the soft mud while gray clouds pressed low overhead. Jonah was there beside me, close enough that I could smell the rain in his dark hair and see the nervous flutter of his pulse in his throat. He told me to close my eyes, his voice barely above a whisper, and I did, trusting him in a way I had never trusted anyone before or since. His hand found mine in that rain-soaked field, and he pressed something small and warm into my palm. I felt the delicate edges, the soft texture of something that had once been alive, and my heart hammered against my ribs with the weight of understanding what this meant, what he was trying to tell me without words. But the memory fractured there, dissolving like smoke before I could grasp what he had given me, leaving only the echo of his fingers against mine and the ache of something lost. I opened my eyes and I was 47 again, sitting in a study that smelled of old books and furniture polish, the letter still unopened before me. The leather chair creaked as I shifted, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another day of careful silence. My hands were shaking slightly as I folded the envelope and slipped it into the desk drawer, burying it beneath tax forms and old bills as though I could hide from whatever truth it contained. The drawer slid shut with a soft whisper, but the sound seemed to echo in the quiet room like a door closing on possibilities I wasn't ready to face. I pressed my palms against the desk's surface, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood that Evelyn had chosen when we first moved to this house, back when we still believed in the life we were building together. Everything in this room spoke of the man I had become, the careful accumulation of respectability and success, but none of it felt like mine anymore. My wedding ring lay where I had left it, catching the lamplight like an accusation. 23 years of marriage reduced to a small circle of gold that suddenly felt as foreign as a costume piece from someone else's life. I could hear Evelyn's breathing through the ceiling above, steady and trusting in sleep, and the sound made my throat close with something that might have been grief. But even as I closed the drawer, I felt the weight of that letter pressing against my chest like a stone. I exhaled slowly, tasting the familiar bitter blend of dread and longing that had followed me for decades like a shadow I could never quite outrun. The memory of Jonah's hand in mine lingered like an echo of warmth in a cold room, and I wondered how much longer I could keep running from the question that had haunted me since I was 17 years old. What had Jonah placed in my hand that day in Peterson's field, and why, after all these years, was I still too afraid to remember? The morning after I hid the letter, I woke to the sound of Evelyn's alarm cutting through the pre-dawn darkness at exactly 6:15, the same time it had chimed for the past decade. She stirred beside me, her movements careful and practiced, designed not to wake me even though I had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and thinking about handwriting I hadn't seen in 30 years. I listened to her bare feet padding across the hardwood floor toward the bathroom, the soft click of the door closing, the whisper of water through the pipes. These sounds had become the rhythm of my days, as predictable as the sunrise that would soon filter through our bedroom curtains, illuminating the framed photographs that lined our dresser like evidence of a life well lived. Our wedding portrait sat in the center, Evelyn radiant in ivory silk, my younger self beaming with what I had believed was love, but now recognized as relief. Relief at having found someone who asked so little of me, who seemed content with the version of myself I was willing to share. Around it, smaller frames captured our children at various stages: Sarah's high school graduation, Michael's college acceptance letter, family vacations to places chosen more for their safety than their beauty. By 7:30, I was downstairs in the kitchen, following the same choreography I had perfected over 2 decades of marriage. Coffee first, 2 scoops of the medium roast Evelyn preferred, though I had always favored something darker. Then the morning paper, spread flat on the granite countertop while I waited for the machine to finish its quiet gurgling. The kitchen was Evelyn's pride, all clean lines and tasteful neutrals, a monument to suburban success that felt as foreign to me as a museum display. Evelyn appeared at 7:45, already dressed for her job at the real estate office, her auburn hair styled in the same shoulder-length cut she had worn since our children were small. She was beautiful in a way that had aged gracefully, her smile still warm, her green eyes still kind. But when she looked at me, I felt like she was seeing through glass, observing someone who resembled her husband but wasn't quite real. She poured her coffee, and we moved through our morning ritual with the efficiency of longtime partners. She mentioned a showing she had scheduled for a colonial on Maple Street. I told her about the presentation I needed to prepare for work, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. We discussed Sarah's upcoming visit and whether we needed to replace the furnace filter, conversations that skimmed the surface of our lives like stones across still water. What we didn't discuss was the way I had been standing at the kitchen window for longer and longer periods each morning, watching the suburban street come alive with people heading to jobs and lives that seemed more genuine than my own. We didn't mention how I had started staying up later, reading books I used to love before I convinced myself that practical concerns were more important than passion. And we certainly didn't talk about the increasing frequency with which I found myself pausing when love scenes flickered across the television screen, not because of the women on display, but because of something indefinable in the men's faces that made my chest tighten with recognition. At 8:15, I kissed Evelyn goodbye on the cheek, a gesture as automatic as breathing, and watched her back her silver sedan out of our driveway. Then I was alone in the house that we had chosen together 20 years ago, surrounded by furniture we had selected with such careful consideration, as if the right sofa and dining room set could somehow anchor us to the life we were supposed to want. The silence that followed her departure was different from the quiet of the night before. This was the silence of emptiness, of rooms filled with objects that belonged to people I wasn't sure I knew anymore. I walked through the living room, past the built-in bookshelves lined with volumes I had stopped reading years ago, past the mantelpiece displaying school pictures and holiday cards from friends whose names I sometimes struggled to remember. Our home was exactly what it appeared to be, a testament to stability, responsibility, and careful planning. The mortgage was nearly paid off. The lawn was perfectly maintained. The gutters were cleaned twice a year, and the driveway was sealed every other summer. From the outside, anyone would assume that the man who lived here had everything he could possibly want. But standing there in my own living room, surrounded by the accumulation of a lifetime of sensible choices, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own success. Every routine had become a chain, every comfort a cage. I had built this life so carefully, brick by brick, year by year, and now I couldn't remember why any of it had seemed important. I thought about the letter hidden in my desk drawer, about the 17-year-old boy who had stood in a rain-soaked field with his heart hammering in his chest, and I wondered when I had stopped being brave enough to feel anything that deeply. When had I learned to settle for the pale imitation of love that came with safety and approval? And why, after all these years of careful contentment, did the prospect of remembering what I had lost feel more terrifying than the thought of spending the rest of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't? 3 weeks passed before anything disrupted the careful rhythm of my days. I had almost convinced myself that the letter in my desk drawer was something I could simply ignore, that if I maintained my routines with enough precision, the past would remain safely buried beneath the weight of the present. Then the mail brought an envelope addressed in cheerful script, the kind of invitation that usually went straight into the recycling bin without a second thought. A 50th birthday celebration for Tom Mitchell, someone I barely remembered from high school. The invitation was printed on cream cardstock with embossed lettering, the kind of formal announcement that spoke of catered events and rented halls. I found myself staring at it over my morning coffee, wondering why anyone would go to such trouble for people they hadn't spoken to in 3 decades. I was about to toss it aside when my eyes caught on a line near the bottom. Please join us for an evening of remembrance and reunion. A partial guest list followed in smaller print, names that triggered faint echoes of recognition. Jennifer Walsh, now Jennifer Brennan, David Stone, Carol Peters, and then 3 names from the bottom, written in the same careful typeface as all the others, but somehow leaping off the page as if illuminated. Jonah Rivers. The coffee cup slipped in my hand, sending a brown splash across the granite countertop. I stared at those 2 words until they seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Jonah Rivers. After 30 years, his name still had the power to stop time, to transport me back to autumn afternoons when the world felt full of possibility and I hadn't yet learned to be afraid of my own heart. The memories came in fragments, sharp and immediate as broken glass. Bonfire nights behind the old Grayson farm, the scent of wood smoke clinging to our clothes as we sat closer together than friendship required. The way Jonah's laugh sounded different when it was just the 2 of us, lower and more intimate, as if he were sharing secrets meant only for me. Study sessions that stretched long past midnight, our textbooks forgotten on the floor, while we talked about books and music and dreams we were too young to realize might be impossible. I remembered the first time I noticed the way his dark hair caught the light, the first time I felt my pulse quicken when he looked at me with those serious brown eyes. The confusion that followed, the fear that what I was feeling was wrong or dangerous or both. The careful distance I had learned to maintain, even as every instinct pulled me closer to him. And then that last autumn, when something between us had shifted and grown urgent. The afternoon walks that became evening conversations. The way our hands would brush when we passed papers back and forth, contact that lasted a fraction of a second too long to be accidental. The electricity that hummed between us whenever we were alone, a tension that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I folded the invitation and slipped it into my briefcase, telling myself I wouldn't go. What was the point of revisiting a past that belonged to a different person, a boy who had made choices I couldn't even remember making? I had a life now, responsibilities, a family who depended on me to be the man they believed I was. The last thing I needed was to complicate that with ghosts from a time when I hadn't known better than to want impossible things. But the invitation seemed to burn against my chest throughout the day. During meetings at work, I found myself distracted, wondering what Jonah looked like now, whether his voice still carried that slight rasp that used to make my breath catch, whether he still had that habit of running his fingers through his hair when he was thinking, or if time and experience had worn away those small gestures that had once been so familiar to me. That evening, as I sat in my study pretending to review quarterly reports, I heard Evelyn's footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway holding my briefcase, her expression puzzled but not unkind. She told me I'd left this downstairs and pulled out the invitation, which had somehow worked its way to the top of my papers. I watched her read it, my heart hammering with the irrational fear that she might somehow divine its significance from the cardstock and careful lettering. She said it sounded lovely and asked if I was planning to go. Her tone was genuinely curious, tinged with the gentle concern she showed whenever I seemed withdrawn or distracted. She mentioned that I hardly saw anyone from those days anymore, that it might be good for me to reconnect with old friends. The irony of her encouragement wasn't lost on me. Here was my wife, unknowingly pushing me toward a reunion with the person who had once made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. But her words carried a kindness that made my chest tighten with guilt. She was trying to take care of me in the only way she knew how, offering what she believed was healing without understanding that some wounds were too deep and complex for simple remedies. I heard myself agreeing before I had consciously made the decision. The words came out of my mouth as if someone else were speaking them, and I watched Evelyn's face brighten with pleased surprise. She said she thought it would be wonderful for me, that I'd been so serious lately, so caught up in work and responsibilities that I'd forgotten how to enjoy myself. If only she knew that enjoyment wasn't what I was afraid of. 2 weeks later, I stood outside the Riverside Community Center, staring up at the warm light spilling from the windows and listening to the sound of voices and laughter drifting into the October evening. I had changed clothes 3 times before leaving the house, finally settling on a navy sweater that Evelyn said brought out my eyes. I felt ridiculous for caring what I looked like, but I couldn't seem to stop my hands from smoothing the fabric or checking my reflection in the car window. Inside, the hall was decorated with balloons and streamers in our old school colors, burgundy and gold that had faded into something more nostalgic than celebratory. Tables lined the walls, covered with yearbook photos and memorabilia that looked like artifacts from someone else's life. The faces around me were familiar but changed, softened by middle age and marked by the accumulation of decades I hadn't shared. I moved through the crowd with the polite smile I had perfected for work functions, accepting handshakes and exchanging pleasantries with people whose names I struggled to remember. Everyone seemed genuinely pleased to see me, asking about my family and my job with the kind of surface curiosity that required no real answers. I found myself falling into the role easily, playing the part of the successful suburban husband and father I had become. Then I saw him. He was standing near the far wall, partly obscured by a cluster of former classmates, but I would have recognized his silhouette anywhere. 30 years had added weight to his shoulders and silver to his temples. But the way he held himself was unchanged, that slight forward lean that suggested he was listening more carefully than anyone else in the room. When he turned and our eyes met across the crowded hall, I felt something I had thought was permanently buried stir to life in my chest. For a moment that stretched like eternity, we simply looked at each other across the space and time that separated us. His face had aged into something more weathered than I had expected, lined by experiences I knew nothing about. But his eyes were exactly as I remembered them, dark and serious and uncommonly kind. When he smiled, that same slow, careful expression I remembered from autumn afternoons 3 decades ago, I felt my careful composure crack like ice in spring. Something alive moved in my chest, something I had spent so many years keeping dormant that I had almost forgotten it existed. And for the first time since I had seen his name on that invitation, I realized that coming here hadn't been a mistake at all. It had been inevitable. The space between us closed slowly, other conversations fading into background noise as Jonah made his way across the room. I found myself cataloging the changes time had etched into his face, the way his dark hair had retreated from his temples and gone silver at the edges, how his shoulders had broadened and his frame had settled into the solid weight of middle age. But when he stopped in front of me, close enough that I could catch the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something newer, something that spoke of a different life than the one I remembered, his smile was exactly as it had been 30 years ago. He said my name quietly, like he was testing the sound of it, and I felt something flutter in my chest that I had forgotten was possible. We shook hands, a gesture that should have been ordinary but felt charged with electricity, his palm warm and slightly rough against mine. The contact lasted a moment longer than politeness required, and when we finally let go, I could still feel the phantom pressure of his fingers. The conversation that followed was careful, circling around safe territories like men who had learned to be cautious with their words. He asked about my work, and I found myself describing my job at the consulting firm with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't felt for it in years. He told me he was teaching now, history at a small college about an hour north of here, and there was something in the way he spoke about his students that suggested he had found a kind of purpose I envied. We talked about the other faces in the room, trying to match aged features with yearbook memories, laughing at how different everyone looked while carefully avoiding any mention of how much we ourselves had changed. He asked if I was still in touch with anyone from our old crowd, and I realized with the start that I wasn't, that somewhere along the way I had let all those connections fade until they existed only in photographs and distant memories. It wasn't until someone mentioned spouses that the careful architecture of our conversation began to shift. I talked about Evelyn and the children with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to present his family like a business portfolio, emphasizing their achievements and stability without revealing anything that mattered. But when I asked about his family, Jonah's expression changed in a way that made me lean closer despite myself. He told me he had been married for 15 years to a woman named Catherine, a good woman who deserved better than what he had been able to give her. His voice carried a weight of regret that seemed too heavy for a casual conversation, and I found myself listening with an intensity that felt dangerous. He said they had divorced 3 years ago, that his children were grown now and living their own lives, and that he was learning to navigate the strange territory of being alone at an age when most people had figured out how to be content. There was something in the way he spoke about solitude that suggested it wasn't entirely unwelcome, as if he had discovered a kind of freedom in no longer having to perform for an audience that had never quite understood the show. He mentioned the relief of no longer pretending, and though he didn't elaborate, something in his tone made my throat tighten with recognition. I found myself hungry for these glimpses of honesty, the way he spoke about mistakes and loneliness without the defensive armor most men our age wore when discussing their failures. With Evelyn, with my children, even with myself, I had learned to present only the polished version of my experiences, the narrative that reflected well on my choices and character. But Jonah seemed to have abandoned that careful editing, and listening to him felt like drinking cool water after years in the desert. As the evening wound down, we exchanged phone numbers with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested we were both trying not to attach too much significance to the gesture. But when he walked me to my car in the parking lot, our conversation continued for another 20 minutes, neither of us seeming willing to end the connection we had rediscovered. A week later, I found myself sitting across from him in a coffee shop downtown, ostensibly because he had mentioned wanting to hear more about my work, but really because I hadn't been able to stop thinking about our conversation at the reunion. The cafe was small and intimate, the kind of place where meaningful conversations happened over ceramic mugs and locally baked pastries, and I felt more present than I had in months. This time, our talk went deeper. He asked about my marriage in a way that suggested he sensed the careful distance I maintained when speaking about Evelyn, and I found myself admitting things I had never said aloud. I told him about the quiet gulf that had opened between us over the years, not born of anger or resentment, but of a kind of emotional exhaustion that came from trying to love someone while keeping the essential parts of yourself hidden. He nodded with the understanding of someone who had lived through similar territory, and then he began to talk about his own marriage with a frankness that left me breathless. He spoke about the years of trying to be the husband Catherine needed, the growing awareness that something fundamental was missing from their connection, the guilt of knowing that his inability to love her completely was slowly eroding both their lives. We met again the following week for a walk along the river path, our conversation flowing with an ease that felt both familiar and entirely new. The October air was crisp and clean, the trees beginning their spectacular transformation into gold and crimson, and I found myself noticing these details with a sharpness I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if Jonah's presence had awakened senses I had forgotten I possessed. It was during this walk that he mentioned the night at Peterson's field, his voice careful and tentative, as if he weren't sure I would remember. I told him I did remember, though not as clearly as I would have liked, and he stopped walking for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above us. He said he had given me a pressed wildflower that night, a violet he had found and saved between the pages of his chemistry textbook for weeks before working up the courage to offer it to me. He said it was the closest he could come to telling me how he felt, a wordless confession he hoped I would understand even if he couldn't say the words aloud. I stood there on the path, the sound of water moving over stones behind us, and felt the memory crystallize with sudden, painful clarity. The delicate petals against my palm, the way they had crumbled slightly under the pressure of my nervous fingers, the weight of understanding what this gesture meant and my own terror at having to respond to it. I remembered folding my hand around that flower and walking away without saying a word, too frightened by the intensity of what I was feeling to acknowledge what he was offering. The regret that washed over me then was so sharp it took my breath away. Here was this moment I had buried for 30 years, this tender declaration I had been too afraid to accept, and now I could see it for what it had truly been. Not just an expression of teenage attraction, but an invitation to step into something real and brave and transformative. An invitation I had been too much of a coward to accept. That night, he called me at home. Evelyn was upstairs reading. The children were both away at college, and I found myself talking to him in whispers from my study while the house settled around us in comfortable silence. Our conversation meandered through memories and observations, touching on books we had both read and music that had shaped us. But underneath it all was a current of something deeper and more urgent. The calls became a regular occurrence, sometimes lasting until well past midnight, filled with long pauses that felt more intimate than words. He would tell me about his day, about the students who frustrated and delighted him, about the small rituals that filled his solitary evenings. I found myself sharing things I had never told anyone, not even Evelyn, about the sense of disconnection that had been growing in me for years, the feeling that I was living someone else's life with increasing skill but decreasing satisfaction. With each conversation, each meeting, I felt something inside me that had been dormant for decades beginning to stir and stretch. It was as if Jonah's presence was allowing me to remember who I had been before I learned to be careful, before I decided that safety was more important than authenticity. In his company, I could feel the man I might have become if I had been brave enough to follow my heart instead of my fear. The contrast with my life at home became more stark with each passing day. The conversations with Evelyn that had once felt comfortable now seemed hollow, filled with the kind of surface information that passed for intimacy but revealed nothing essential. The routines that had once provided structure now felt like prison walls, each repeated gesture a reminder of how small I had allowed my world to become. I began to notice things that had been invisible to me before. The way Evelyn's eyes would sometimes search my face as if looking for someone who wasn't there. The careful distance we maintained even when we were in the same room. The way our conversations never ventured into territory that might require either of us to reveal something vulnerable or real. Most painful of all was the growing awareness that my marriage had become a performance we were both too polite to acknowledge. We had learned to love each other's masks so well that we had forgotten what lay underneath. And now I wasn't sure either of us remembered how to remove them even if we wanted to. But with Jonah, the mask fell away without effort. In his presence, I felt seen and understood in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. He looked at me and somehow recognized the person I had been at 17, the boy who had dreams and fears and longings he didn't know how to name. And slowly, carefully, he was helping me remember what it felt like to be that person again. The moment came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, when the trees had shed their leaves and the world had settled into that stark beauty that comes just before winter claims everything. Jonah had suggested we walk along the river path again, and I had agreed despite the gray sky that threatened rain, drawn by the promise of another hour in his company where I could remember what it felt like to be authentic. The path was nearly empty, other walkers having been deterred by the chill wind that sent dead leaves skittering across the pavement like whispered secrets. We walked in comfortable silence for the first mile, our footsteps finding an easy rhythm that spoke of how naturally we moved together, how our bodies seemed to remember a synchronization that had nothing to do with conscious thought. It was Jonah who broke the quiet, his voice carrying a hesitation I had rarely heard from him since we had begun meeting again. He said he had been thinking about those autumn afternoons when we were 17, trying to piece together memories that had grown hazy with time and distance. Then he stopped walking altogether, turning to face me with an expression that made my chest tighten with anticipation and dread. He told me he had spent years wondering if he had imagined the connection between us, if the intensity he had felt during those long conversations and shared silences had been nothing more than teenage wishful thinking projected onto a friendship that was probably perfectly ordinary. His voice was quiet but steady as he spoke, his dark eyes searching my face for some sign of recognition or confirmation. "You never said anything," he murmured, and the pain in those words cut through me like a blade. I thought maybe I made it all up. Maybe I was just a lonely kid who wanted something to be there that wasn't really there at all. The vulnerability in his admission shattered whatever remained of my careful composure. Here was this man I had been falling in love with all over again. This person who had spent 30 years doubting the reality of something that had shaped every choice I had made since I was 17 years old. The injustice of it, the waste of it, the sheer tragic comedy of two people who had been too afraid to speak what they both felt, overwhelmed me with a force that left me breathless. I heard myself saying his name, my voice raw with emotion I could no longer contain. And then the words came pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. 30 years of silence finally giving way to truth. I told him I had loved him then, completely and desperately, and with a purity I hadn't known was possible. I told him about the sleepless nights I had spent thinking about him, about the way my heart would race whenever he looked at me, about the terror I had felt when I realized that what I was feeling was real and dangerous and completely at odds with everything I had been taught to want. I told him I had never stopped loving him, not really, that every choice I had made since had been measured against the memory of what I had felt for him and found wanting. My marriage, my career, my children, the entire careful architecture of my adult life had been built around the hollow space where that love should have been, a monument to cowardice disguised as respectability. The words came faster now, my voice breaking as I confessed that I had spent decades trying to convince myself that what we had shared was just a phase, a confusion that would pass if I ignored it long enough. But it had never passed. Instead, it had gone underground, shaping me in ways I was only beginning to understand, turning me into a man who could love others, but never completely, never with the totality I had once offered to him. I told him about the pressed violet, how I had kept it between the pages of my chemistry book for weeks after he gave it to me, how I would touch it sometimes when I was alone and remember the weight of his fingers against my palm. I admitted that I had thrown it away the night before I left for college, terrified that someone might find it and understand what it meant, and that I had regretted that act of cowardice every day since. By the time I finished speaking, I was trembling, my hands shaking with the magnitude of what I had finally allowed myself to say aloud. The gray sky above us seemed to press down like a weight, and I realized that somewhere during my confession the first drops of rain had begun to fall, cold against my heated face. Jonah stepped closer, close enough that I could see the tears gathering in his eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the November chill. Without hesitation, without looking around to see if anyone might be watching, he reached out and took my hand in both of his. The contact sent a shock through my entire system, 30 years of careful distance collapsing in an instant. His hands were warm and strong and completely familiar, as if no time had passed at all since that afternoon when he had pressed a flower into my palm and waited for me to be brave enough to understand what he was offering. I broke down then, completely and without reservation. 30 years of grief poured out of me in great shuddering sobs that shook my entire frame. Grief for the boy I had been and the man I might have become, grief for all the years we had lost, and all the love we had wasted on people who could never fully have us because we had never fully belonged to ourselves. Through my tears, I told him that everything I had built was a compromise, a carefully constructed performance designed to keep the world from seeing who I really was. My marriage, my fatherhood, my entire identity as a successful suburban professional was nothing more than an elaborate costume that had grown so tight over the years that I could barely breathe inside it. Jonah held my hand through all of it, his thumb stroking across my knuckles in a gesture so tender it made me cry harder. He didn't try to quiet me or tell me it would be all right or offer any of the empty consolations that people usually provide when confronted with someone else's breakdown. He simply stood there in the rain and witnessed my pain without flinching, accepting the gift of my honesty with the gravity it deserved. When I finally quieted, when the storm inside me had spent itself and left me hollow and exhausted, he spoke again. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, a place where he had learned to stop being afraid of his own truth. "You don't have to keep choosing silence," he said, and the words hit me with the force of revelation. It wasn't just an observation about our past or a suggestion for our future. It was an invitation and a challenge, a recognition that I stood at a crossroads where I could either continue living the lie I had constructed or finally have the courage to step into the light. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through our jackets and plastering our hair to our heads, but neither of us moved to seek shelter. We stood there on the empty path holding hands like teenagers, two middle-aged men who had finally found the courage to speak the truth that had been burning inside them for 3 decades. I looked into Jonah's eyes and saw my own reflection there. Not the careful mask I had worn for so long, but the raw, honest face of the person I had been before I learned to be afraid. And I understood with perfect clarity that whatever came next, whatever price I would have to pay for this moment of authenticity, there could be no going back to the silence that had defined my life for so long. The truth had been spoken, and it had set something free inside me that could never be caged again. I drove home through the rain with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, Jonah's words echoing in my head like a prayer I had finally learned to say. "You don't have to keep choosing silence." The truth I had spoken on that riverbank hung around me like a new skin, raw and sensitive, but undeniably real. There was no taking it back now, no retreat into the comfortable numbness that had defined my adult life. The house looked exactly as I had left it that morning, warm light spilling from the windows onto the rain-darkened driveway, my suburban sanctuary unchanged by the earthquake that had just rearranged my entire world. But as I pulled into the garage and sat listening to the engine tick as it cooled, I knew that I was no longer the same man who had backed out of this same space 6 hours earlier. Evelyn was waiting for me at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes, but with her shoes kicked off, a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. She looked up when I entered, and I saw something in her expression that made my chest tighten with fresh guilt. It was the look of a woman who had been preparing for a conversation she didn't want to have, the careful alertness of someone who sensed that familiar ground was about to shift beneath her feet. She said I looked like I had been crying, her voice gentle but probing, and I realized that my careful composure had abandoned me completely. Whatever mask I usually wore when I came home from my meetings with Jonah was gone, leaving my face raw and honest in a way that must have been impossible to miss. I sat down across from her at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped our children with homework and planned family vacations, and discussed the mundane details that make up a shared life. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken knowledge, until finally, she asked the question I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "Is there someone else?" she said quietly, and the words hung in the air like a challenge I could no longer avoid. I could have lied. Even then, even after everything that had happened on the riverbank, I could have retreated into the safety of deception and bought myself more time to figure out how to manage this crisis without destroying everything I had built. But sitting there looking at this woman who had loved me as well as she could for 23 years, I found that I no longer had the energy for lies. My voice broke as I told her yes. There was someone else, but not in the way she was thinking. I told her about Jonah, about the boy I had loved at 17 and the man I was falling in love with again at 47. But more than that, I told her about myself, about the years of pretending to be someone I wasn't, about the hollowness that had grown inside me with each passing year of living a lie. I watched her face change as I spoke, cycling through disbelief and hurt and anger before settling into something that looked almost like relief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands wrapped around the teacup as if it might provide answers to questions she had never known how to ask. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that held more sadness than surprise and told me she had felt my absence long before tonight. She said she had known for years that there was some essential part of me that I kept locked away, that no matter how hard she tried to reach it, there was always a wall between us that she couldn't penetrate or understand. Our marriage, she said with a calmness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been, had become a partnership of appearances rather than intimacy. We had learned to love each other's performances so well that we had forgotten there were real people underneath, and now she wondered if either of us remembered how to be authentic anymore. The conversation that followed was the most honest one we had shared in years, maybe ever. She told me about her own loneliness, about the nights she had lain awake wondering what she had done wrong, why her husband felt so distant even when he was lying right beside her. She spoke about the gradual erosion of hope that comes when you realize that someone you love is fundamentally unknowable to you, not because they won't let you in, but because they don't know how to let themselves out. When the children called that weekend, I told them separately, each conversation a fresh exercise in breaking hearts I had helped create. Sarah listened in stunned silence before hanging up without saying goodbye. Michael asked trembling questions I couldn't answer, wanting to understand how everything he thought he knew about his family could suddenly be different. I didn't offer them easy explanations or false comfort. I simply told them the truth as plainly as I could, that I couldn't live a lie anymore, that the cost of pretending to be someone I wasn't had become higher than the cost of being who I really was. I told them I was sorry for the pain this would cause them, but that I couldn't apologize for finally finding the courage to be honest. The weeks that followed were an exercise in controlled demolition. Lawyers were consulted, papers were drawn up, possessions were divided with the careful efficiency of people who wanted to cause each other as little additional pain as possible. Evelyn was gracious in a way that made my guilt almost unbearable, handling the practical details of our separation with the same competence she had brought to every other aspect of our shared life. Friends and colleagues reacted with varying degrees of shock and confusion. Some offered support, others judgment. Most simply disappeared into the awkward silence that surrounds the wreckage of what everyone assumed was a successful marriage. I learned that coming out at 47 was a different beast entirely from the teenage exploration I had once been too afraid to attempt. It was messier, more complicated, weighted with decades of choices that couldn't be undone. But through all of it, through the lawyers and the difficult conversations and the gradual dismantling of the life I had spent decades building, there was also something else emerging. A lightness I hadn't felt since I was 17. A sense of space opening up inside me where there had once been only the tight compression of secrets and shame. The cost of authenticity was indeed brutal. Hearts were broken, including my own. A family story was shattered, leaving all of us to figure out how to write new narratives from the fragments that remained. Children had to reconcile the father they thought they knew with the stranger who had taken his place. A good woman had to rebuild her understanding of love and marriage and the ways we fail each other despite our best intentions. And yet, standing in the wreckage of everything I had once thought mattered, I could feel something that might have been freedom beginning to take root. For the first time in 30 years, I was living without the exhausting weight of pretense, without the constant fear that someone might discover who I really was. The truth had set me free, just as I had always heard it would, but freedom, I was learning, was not the same thing as happiness. It was something both harder and more necessary, the possibility of becoming whole. 6 months later, I found myself back in the study where this all began, though everything had changed and nothing looked quite the same. The house was smaller now, a rented townhouse across town where the morning light fell differently through unfamiliar windows. The furniture was a mixture of pieces from my old life and new purchases that reflected choices I had made for myself alone, without considering anyone else's preferences or needs. The desk was the same one from my former study, but it sat in a different room now, facing a window that looked out onto a garden someone else had planted. My books lined the shelves in a new order that made sense only to me, arranged by affection rather than the alphabetical system Evelyn had always preferred. It was a space that belonged entirely to the person I had finally allowed myself to become. The letter lay open on the desk beside my discarded wedding ring, both artifacts from a life that felt simultaneously distant and immediate. I had finally found the courage to break the seal 2 weeks after the divorce papers were signed, when the last of the legal formalities had been completed and I could no longer use the chaos of separation as an excuse to avoid confronting the words Jonah had written to me 3 decades ago. The handwriting was exactly as I remembered it, careful and steady, though the ink had faded to the color of autumn leaves. The message inside was shorter than I had expected, just a few lines written on cream-colored paper that had yellowed at the edges with time. But the words carried the weight of everything we had never been able to say to each other when we were 17 and too afraid to trust what we were feeling. "I was always waiting for you to open your hand," the letter said, and beneath those words was a small pressed violet, somehow still intact after all these years, its petals translucent with age, but unmistakably the same flower he had given me in Peterson's field. He had saved it all this time, kept it safe through marriage and divorce and 30 years of wondering if what we had shared was real. I touched the flower gently, marveling at its fragility and endurance, and felt something in my chest that might have been peace. The boy who had been too frightened to accept this gift had finally grown into a man who could appreciate what it represented. Not just love, but the courage to offer love without guarantees, the willingness to be vulnerable even when vulnerability carried the risk of rejection or worse. My wedding ring caught the morning light where it lay beside the letter, a circle of gold that had once represented everything I thought I wanted and now served as a reminder of how much I had learned about the difference between safety and happiness. I didn't hate the ring or what it had meant, just as I couldn't bring myself to hate the man I had been when I first slipped it onto my finger. That man had done the best he could with the tools he had, even if those tools had ultimately proven inadequate for the life he was trying to build. The conversations with Jonah had continued throughout the difficult months of separation and divorce, careful explorations of what we might be to each other now that we were finally free to find out. We weren't 17 anymore, and the love we were building bore little resemblance to the intense, wordless connection we had shared as teenagers. This was something more deliberate and conscious, shaped by the awareness of what we had both lost and gained in the years between then and now. There were no easy answers to the questions we faced. How do you love someone when you're both carrying the weight of other lives, other commitments, other people you have hurt in the process of becoming honest? How do you build something new on the foundation of such old pain? We were learning to navigate these complexities together, two middle-aged men who had finally found the courage to stop apologizing for who they were. Sarah had started speaking to me again, tentative conversations that danced around the edges of understanding. Michael remained distant, still processing the revelation that his father was not the man he had thought he knew. Evelyn had moved on with a grace that humbled me, finding her own version of freedom in a life that no longer required her to love someone who could never fully love her back. The healing would take time, maybe years, but it had begun. I exhaled slowly and let my hand rest open on the desk, palm upward, fingers relaxed in a way they hadn't been for decades. Outside the window, dawn was breaking over the unfamiliar garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise something I couldn't yet name. The life I had known was over, dismantled with surgical precision and careful attention to minimizing collateral damage, but what remained felt clean and honest in a way nothing had for 30 years. I thought about the 17-year-old boy who had stood in Peterson's field with his heart hammering in his chest, too afraid to accept the gift he was being offered. I thought about the decades of compromise and careful distance that had followed, the marriage built on foundations of mutual protection rather than mutual understanding. And I thought about the man I was becoming, someone who could finally receive love without flinching, who no longer needed to hide the essential parts of himself from the world. The letter rustled softly in the morning breeze coming through the open window, and I carefully folded it closed around the pressed violet, this time with the reverence it had always deserved. Some gifts take 30 years to accept. Some truths require a lifetime of preparation before they can be spoken aloud. But when the moment finally comes, when you find the courage to open your hand and receive what has been offered, the waiting suddenly makes perfect sense. For the first time in decades, I breathed freely.